The entrance of a simple man into a luxurious temple caused commotion, mockery, and expulsion. What no one knew was that this beggar would return the next day as the owner of the place. And before everyone, he called a barefoot girl, the only one who had offered him respect when everyone else had given him contempt. If you were touched by this beautiful story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing, the polished marble floors of Westfield Grand, Boston's most exclusive department store, gleamed under crystal chandeliers that had been imported from Italy at a cost that could have fed a small nation. Located in the heart of Beacon Hill, the store catered to Boston's elite, old money families whose ancestors had arrived on the Mayflower, tech entrepreneurs who'd made their billions before turning 30, and celebrities seeking refuge from the prying eyes of the public in a place where wealth was the only passport required for entry. Jackson Hayes studied his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his penthouse apartment overlooking Boston Harbor. The man staring back at him was unrecognizable. His normally clean-shaven face was covered in a scraggly beard, meticulously applied with spirit gum and real hair by a Hollywood makeup artist who owed him a favor. His perfectly tailored suits had been replaced by tattered jeans and a stained hoodie purchased from a thrift store. His manicured hands were now dirty, with carefully applied grime under the fingernails. Even his posture had changed. The confident stance of a man who controlled a technology empire worth billions had given way to the hunched shoulders of someone who had been beaten down by life. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Mr. Hayes?" asked Thomas, his personal assistant of 15 years, who stood in the doorway with a concerned expression. Jackson turned to face him. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Thomas. But, sir, there must be other ways to what? To see how people really behave when they don't know they're in the presence of the 8th richest man in America." Jackson shook his head. "For years, I've watched people change the moment they realize who I am. The fake smiles, the sudden interest in what I have to say, the laughing at jokes that aren't funny. I'm tired of it. I need to know if there's any genuine humanity left out there." Thomas sighed. "And this experiment of yours, sir, what exactly do you hope to accomplish?" Jackson looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. "I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. But I need to understand how invisible people are treated. Real invisibility, not the kind you get when you're surrounded by security guards and yes-men." The idea had come to him 3 weeks ago, during a charity gala where he'd donated $50 million to homeless shelters across New England. The applause had been thunderous, the praise effusive. Yet as he'd been driven home that night, he'd seen homeless people huddled in doorways, completely ignored by passers-by. The contrast had been stark, celebrated for writing a check, while those actually suffering were treated as if they didn't exist. "The car will drop me 3 blocks away," Jackson said, slipping his feet into worn-out sneakers with holes in the soles. "No one is to know about this, Thomas. Not my board, not my family, not even Stephanie." His fiancée, Stephanie Warner, heiress to the Warner Pharmaceuticals fortune, was currently in Europe on a shopping trip. "And if something happens to you, sir," Jackson patted the pocket of his ragged jeans. "Burner phone. I'll call if there's an emergency. Otherwise, expect me back this evening." 30 minutes later, Jackson stood across the street from Westfield Grand, watching as Boston's elite streamed in and out of the revolving doors, shopping bags in hand. Security guards in crisp uniforms stood at attention, their eyes scanning for potential trouble, people like the man Jackson was pretending to be. He took a deep breath and crossed the street. As he approached the entrance, a security guard's eyes locked onto him, narrowing slightly, but the man made no move to stop him. Jackson pushed through the revolving door and stepped into the rarefied air of luxury. The scent hit him first, an expertly crafted blend of expensive perfumes, leather, and the indefinable smell of money. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, creating a soundtrack for the theater of consumption that played out across the sales floor. Customers moved from counter to counter, examining items that cost more than what many Americans made in a month. Jackson shuffled forward, keeping his head down but his eyes alert. He noticed how people moved away from him, creating a bubble of space as if his poverty might be contagious. Sales associates watched him with suspicion, their smiles faltering when they caught sight of him. He made his way to the men's department, running his dirty fingers over a cashmere sweater that he knew cost $2,000. He owned 3 in different colors. A sales associate approached, her heels clicking on the marble floor like tiny hammers. "Sir," she said, her voice cold. "Can I help you?" Jackson looked up, making eye contact. "Just looking. This section might not be suitable for your needs. Perhaps I can direct you to the exit?" Before Jackson could respond, a man in an expensive suit appeared. Marcus Reynolds, the store manager. Jackson recognized him immediately. They'd met at multiple charity events, though there was no sign of recognition in Reynolds's eyes now. "Is there a problem here, Vanessa?" Reynolds asked, his gaze fixed on Jackson with undisguised contempt. "This gentleman was touching the merchandise," the sales associate replied. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Reynolds said, his voice rising enough that nearby customers turned to watch. "This is a private establishment, and we reserve the right to refuse service." "I'm just looking," Jackson repeated, curious how far this would go. Reynolds's face hardened. "Security," he called, snapping his fingers as if summoning a dog. 2 large men in dark suits appeared almost instantly. "Please escort this individual from the premises," Reynolds said, "and ensure he doesn't return." The security guards each took one of Jackson's arms, their grips tight enough to bruise. "Hey, take it easy," Jackson protested, not having to fake his discomfort. "Shut up," one guard muttered under his breath. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." As they dragged him toward the exit, Jackson became acutely aware of the stares and whispers. A woman clutched her designer handbag closer to her body as he passed. A man in a tailored suit chuckled and whispered something to his companion, who laughed in response. "Look at that," a teenage boy said loudly to his friends. "There goes the trash. I bet he was trying to steal something," his friend replied. Reynolds followed behind, hands clasped behind his back, supervising the removal of this stain on his perfect store. As they neared the doors, he stepped forward. "Let me make something perfectly clear," he said, his voice low and threatening. "People like you don't belong here. This store is for customers who can actually afford to shop, not for beggars looking for handouts or a warm place to spend the afternoon." The security guards pushed Jackson through the revolving door and onto the sidewalk, hard enough that he stumbled and nearly fell. "Stay out," one of them warned before they turned and re-entered the store, leaving Jackson alone on the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. In less than 15 minutes he had been judged, condemned and cast out, all because of his appearance. No one had bothered to speak to him like a human being. No one had shown even a flicker of compassion. Jackson moved to a stone bench near the store entrance and sat down, his mind racing. He had expected to be treated differently, but the level of contempt had surprised even him. As he contemplated his next move, he noticed a small figure watching him from the shadows of an alleyway across the street. Chapter 2. The Little Angel. Emma Sullivan had learned to be invisible by the age of 7. It was a necessary skill when you lived on the streets of Boston, especially in neighborhoods like Beacon Hill, where poverty was treated as an offense against public decency. Her small size helped. She could slip into spaces adults couldn't reach, hide behind dumpsters and move through crowds unnoticed. She had perfected the art of being unseen, except when she chose to be visible. Today, she had chosen a spot near Westfield Grand, not because she expected kindness from the wealthy shoppers, but because the alley behind the store often contained discarded items that were still perfectly usable. Just last week, she had found a cashmere scarf with a small tear that someone had thrown away rather than repair. It now served as both scarf and pillow, depending on the time of day. Emma's life hadn't always been like this. Until 6 months ago, she had lived in a small apartment with her mother, Sarah Sullivan, a hard-working waitress who had struggled to make ends meet but had always managed to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Then came her mother's illness, swift and devastating. The medical bills had piled up, and then her mother had disappeared from the hospital. The social worker had tried to place Emma in foster care, but Emma had run away, determined to wait for her mother's return. She didn't understand that her mother wasn't coming back. Now, Emma survived on her wits and the occasional kindness of a few people who noticed her, like Miss Rosie at the bakery, who sometimes slipped her day-old pastries, or Mr. Chen at the convenience store, who pretended not to see when she pocketed a granola bar. But such kindnesses were rare, especially in this part of the city where wealth had a way of blinding people to suffering. Emma watched as the man in dirty clothes was thrown out of the fancy store. She had witnessed similar scenes before, the invisible being made briefly visible only to be cast away again. There was something different about this man, though. Despite his ragged appearance, he carried himself with a dignity that seemed at odds with his circumstances. When the security guards pushed him, Emma had felt a flare of indignation on his behalf. She observed as he sat on the bench, looking thoughtful rather than defeated. Most people in his situation would have shuffled away, heads down, spirits broken. But this man seemed to be studying the situation. It intrigued her. Emma's throat was dry. She had been nursing her small water bottle all day, taking tiny sips to make it last. Looking at the man, she made a decision. Clutching her precious water bottle, she darted across the street, dodging between cars with the nimble expertise of a child who had learned that traffic laws were luxuries for those who didn't need to hurry. Jackson looked up to see a small girl approaching him. Her clothes were worn but relatively clean, her brown hair tangled but pulled back in a messy ponytail, secured with what looked like a piece of ribbon. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes, a startling clear blue, were alert and intelligent. She stopped a few feet away, regarding him with caution, like a wild animal ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "Are you okay, mister?" she asked, her voice surprisingly clear and articulate. Jackson was taken aback. This was the first person who had spoken to him as a human being since he had donned his disguise. "I'm fine," he replied. "Just resting." The girl nodded, considering this. Then, with a decisive movement, she stepped forward and held out a plastic water bottle that was about 1/3 full. "You look thirsty," she said simply. Jackson stared at the bottle, then at the girl. The significance of what she was doing hit him with unexpected force. This child, who clearly had almost nothing, was offering him her water, probably one of the few possessions she could truly call her own. "That's very kind of you," he said, his voice rough with sudden emotion. "But don't you need it?" She shrugged. "I can get more. There's a fountain in the park." Jackson hesitated, then accepted the bottle. He took a small sip, conscious that he shouldn't deplete her supply. The water was warm and had a slightly metallic taste, but in that moment, it seemed more precious than the finest champagne he had ever tasted. "Thank you," he said, returning the bottle. "What's your name?" "Emma," she replied, taking the bottle back but making no move to leave. "I'm Jackson. Do you live around here, Emma?" Her expression became guarded. "Sort of." Jackson nodded, understanding her caution. "I appreciate the water. Not many people would have done that." Emma's face softened slightly. "Those people in there were mean. They shouldn't have pushed you." "No, they shouldn't have," Jackson agreed. "But that's how some people are when they think someone is worth less than them." "That's stupid," Emma declared with the straightforward logic of a child. "My mom always said you can't tell what someone's worth by looking at their clothes." "Your mom sounds like a wise woman." A shadow passed over Emma's face. She was. The past tense and the grief in those simple words told Jackson everything he needed to know. This child was alone in the world. "Where do you stay, Emma?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then gestured vaguely. "Different places. There's a good spot behind the library when it's not too cold." Jackson's heart constricted. While he had been playing at being homeless for a social experiment, this child was actually living the reality, day after day. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Emma's eyes lit up briefly before caution reasserted itself. "Maybe. Why?" "Because I have a few dollars, and I thought maybe we could get something to eat." Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out some crumpled bills. He had deliberately brought only a small amount of cash to maintain his cover. Emma eyed the money suspiciously. "Why would you share with me?" "Because you shared with me," Jackson replied simply. "And because I could use the company." After a moment's deliberation, Emma nodded. "There's a hot dog stand around the corner. They have good fries." They walked together, an unlikely pair, the disguised billionaire and the homeless child. The hot dog vendor gave them a wary look, but took Jackson's money readily enough. They sat on a park bench, eating in companionable silence. "So what happened to you?" Emma asked eventually. dipping a fry in ketchup. "Why were you in that fancy store?" Jackson considered how to answer. "I wanted to see how they'd treat someone who looked like me." Emma gave him a shrewd look. "Like an experiment?" Jackson was startled by her perceptiveness. "Something like that. My teacher, when I used to go to school, said experiments are how we learn things. And what do you think I learned today?" Emma chewed thoughtfully. "That some people are jerks," she suggested. Jackson laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised him. "That's definitely part of it. What are you going to do now?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it struck Jackson that he hadn't thought beyond his experiment. What was he going to do with what he had learned? "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "But I think I might try to make some changes." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Good. That place needs changing." As they finished their meal, Jackson found himself reluctant to part ways with this wise little soul. "Emma, is there someone looking after you? Someone I could call?" Her face closed off immediately. "I'm fine on my own. I don't need foster care or anything. I'm waiting for my mom to get better and come back." The words pierced Jackson's heart. This child was living in denial about her mother's fate, creating a fantasy that allowed her to survive emotionally. "I understand," he said softly. "But it can be dangerous out here for someone on their own." "I'm careful," Emma insisted. "And I'm good at hiding." Jackson knew he couldn't push further without frightening her away. "Well, I'll be around this area tomorrow, too. Maybe we'll run into each other again." Emma studied him, seeming to weigh his words for deceit. Finally, she nodded. "Maybe. I like you, Jackson. You're not like most grown-ups." "I'll take that as a compliment," he smiled, as Emma walked away, disappearing with practiced ease into the urban landscape. Jackson remained on the bench, his mind working furiously. His experiment had taken an unexpected turn. What had begun as a personal quest to understand how the other half lived had become something else entirely. A stark confrontation with the reality of a system that failed its most vulnerable members. He pulled out his burner phone and sent a text to Thomas. "Change of plans. I'll be staying out tonight. Don't worry." Then he settled in to wait, observing the flow of humanity around him with new eyes. Tomorrow would bring phase 2 of his experiment, one that had now taken on a purpose far beyond what he had initially imagined. Chapter 3: The Plan. Jackson spent the night in a homeless shelter, 6 blocks away from Westfield Grand. He had almost used his real name when signing in before catching himself at the last moment and giving the name Jack Smith instead. The experience was eye-opening. The shelter was clean but crowded, with narrow cots lined up in rows. Privacy was non-existent. The man on the cot next to his, who introduced himself as Veteran Joe, had lost his leg in Afghanistan and his home to medical debt. Another resident, a former accountant named Philip, had spiraled into homelessness after his wife's lengthy battle with cancer had depleted their savings and broken his spirit. Each person had a story, and as Jackson listened, he was struck by how many of these stories hinged on moments of misfortune rather than personal failing. A medical emergency, a job loss, a mental health crisis without access to proper care. The razor-thin margin between stability and catastrophe for so many Americans was staggering. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by snores, mumbles, and occasional cries from those battling their demons in dreams. By morning, Jackson's back ached from the thin mattress, and the stubble on his face had grown more authentic. He declined breakfast at the shelter, not wanting to take food that others needed more desperately, and instead found a small diner where he could get coffee and plan his next move. Sitting in a corner booth, nursing a cup of black coffee that cost less than what he typically tipped for coffee service in high-end restaurants, Jackson opened a small notebook he had purchased from a convenience store. In it, he began to outline what he had learned and what he intended to do about it. The bell above the diner door jingled, and Jackson looked up out of habit. His heart nearly stopped. Stephanie Warner, his fiancée, walked in wearing designer exercise clothes. Her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, large sunglasses perched on her perfect nose. She was supposed to be in Europe for another week. What was she doing in this neighborhood, in this particular diner? Jackson hunched lower in his booth, pulling his hood up further to shadow his face. Stephanie approached the counter, speaking to the middle-aged waitress in a tone that managed to be simultaneously friendly and condescending. "Hi there. I was just finishing my morning run and realized I'm absolutely parched. Could I get a sparkling water, please?" "No ice." The waitress raised an eyebrow. "We've got tappy. Water or bottled water, honey. Nothing sparkling unless you count the dish soap." Stephanie laughed as if this were the most charming exchange she'd ever had. "Bottled water would be lovely then. And do you have any fresh fruit?" "I'm famished but watching my carbs. There's some apple slices that come with the kids' meals. I can sell you those separate." "Perfect." As Stephanie waited for her order, she scanned the diner with idle curiosity. Her gaze passed over Jackson without a flicker of recognition, which was both a relief and strangely painful. The woman he planned to marry couldn't recognize him, simply because he was dressed differently, and sitting in a place she never expected to find him. When her order arrived, Stephanie paid and left a tip that Jackson knew was intended to impress rather than express genuine appreciation. He watched through the window as she walked to her parked Tesla, got in and drove away. The encounter left Jackson unsettled. He had always known that he and Stephanie came from similar privileged backgrounds, but he had believed there was more substance to her than what he had just witnessed. Or perhaps he had simply never looked closely enough to see beyond the polished surface they both presented to the world. Putting thoughts of Stephanie aside for now, Jackson returned to his notebook. He wrote down a detailed account of his experience at Westfield Grand, particularly the behavior of Marcus Reynolds, the manager who had humiliated him publicly. He made notes about the security guards who had manhandled him and the sales associates who had treated him with contempt. And then, on a fresh page, he began to outline a plan. Phase 1 would take place today. He would return to his penthouse, clean up, and transform back into Jackson Hayes, tech billionaire and philanthropist. He would make some calls, set some wheels in motion, and prepare for Phase 2. Phase 2 would occur tomorrow. He would return to Westfield Grand, not as a homeless man, but as himself, one of the wealthiest men in America and a potential major investor in the retail chain that owned the store. But before any of that, he had a more immediate concern, finding Emma again. The thought of that little girl spending another night on the streets, while he returned to his penthouse with its heated floors and personal chef, made him physically ill. But he knew he couldn't simply approach her as a wealthy stranger. That would frighten her away. He needed to gain her trust first, as Jackson the homeless man, before he could help her as Jackson Hayes. Finishing his coffee, Jackson left the diner and made his way back toward Westfield Grand. He spent the morning wandering the area, checking alleys, parks, and the library Emma had mentioned. By midday, there was still no sign of her, and Jackson was beginning to worry. Children on the streets were vulnerable in ways that turned his stomach to consider. He was about to give up and implement Phase 1 of his plan when he spotted a flash of movement behind a dumpster in the alley next to an upscale restaurant. Moving closer, he called out softly, "Emma, it's Jackson from yesterday." After a moment of silence, Emma's small face appeared around the edge of the dumpster. When she recognized him, she emerged fully, clutching a paper bag. "Hi," she said cautiously. "I was hoping I'd find you," Jackson said, keeping his distance to avoid spooking her. "What have you got there?" Emma held up the bag. "Leftover bread from the restaurant. They throw out the stuff they don't use by the end of lunch." The thought of this child digging through restaurant trash for food made Jackson's resolve harden even further. "Smart thinking," he said, keeping his tone light. "But I was thinking maybe we could get something hot for lunch today. My treat." Emma's eyes lit up, but suspicion quickly followed. "Why are you being so nice to me?" Jackson considered his answer carefully. "Because someone was nice to me when I needed it. And because I like talking to you. You're a good kid, Emma." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, but no fancy places where they'll look at us funny." "Deal, you choose." Emma led him to a small taco shop several blocks away. The owners, an elderly Mexican couple, greeted Emma with warm smiles, suggesting they knew her. "Ah, pequeña Emma," the woman said. "Hungry today?" "Yes, Mrs. Alvarez, this is my friend Jackson. He's buying lunch." Mrs. Alvarez looked Jackson over, clearly noting his disheveled appearance but making no comment about it. "Any friend of Emma's is welcome here. Sit." They settled at a small table, and Mrs. Alvarez brought them water without being asked. Emma ordered with the confidence of a regular, and Jackson followed her lead. "They're nice," Jackson commented after Mrs. Alvarez had returned to the kitchen. "Do you come here often?" "Sometimes," Emma said, sipping her water. "Mr. Alvarez gives me tacos when he has extra, and doesn't make me feel bad about it." As they ate their food, possibly the best tacos Jackson had ever tasted, despite having dined at some of the most expensive Mexican restaurants in the country, he gently probed for more information about Emma's situation. "So, you mentioned your mom yesterday," he began carefully. "Is she in the hospital?" Emma's face clouded. "She was, but then she went away. The nurse said she went to heaven, but I think she's just at a different hospital. She'll come back when she's better." Jackson's heart broke for her. "And there's no other family? No one looking after you?" Emma shook her head. "Just me and Mom. My dad left when I was a baby. Mom said he wasn't ready to be a dad." "What about school? Do you still go?" "Not since Mom got sick. They'd put me in foster care if they knew I was alone." Her chin jutted out defiantly. "I don't need foster care. I'm doing fine on my own." Jackson nodded, not wanting to challenge her directly. "You seem very capable. But everyone needs help sometimes. Even grown-ups like me." Emma studied him thoughtfully. "Is that why you were at that fancy store? Looking for help?" "In a way," Jackson admitted. "I was looking for something at least." "Did you find it?" Jackson smiled. "I'm still figuring that out, but meeting you has helped me see some things more clearly." They finished their meal and Jackson paid, leaving a generous tip that made Mrs. Alvarez's eyes widen slightly. As they stepped outside, Jackson knew it was time to implement phase 1 of his plan, but he was reluctant to leave Emma. "Emma, I need to go take care of something important," he said. "But I'd like to meet you again tomorrow if that's okay. Same place we met yesterday around noon." Emma looked at him suspiciously. "Why?" "Because I think I might be able to help you. And because I enjoy your company." After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Okay, but if you don't show up, I won't wait around." "That's fair. I promise I'll be there." As they parted ways, Jackson felt a growing sense of purpose. His experiment had evolved into something far more meaningful than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about exposing the ugliness of class prejudice anymore. It was about making tangible change in individual lives, starting with one little girl who had shown him more humanity than all the wealthy elites he'd encountered at Westfield Grand. He made his way to a secluded spot several blocks away and called Thomas to send a car for him. It was time to transform back into Jackson Hayes and set the wheels of justice in motion. Chapter 4. The Revelation. The transformation from homeless Jackson back to Jackson Hayes, tech billionaire, was swift and meticulous. In his penthouse bathroom, Thomas helped remove the spirit gum and fake beard, while Jackson showered away the accumulated grime of his experiment. The hot water sluicing over his body felt like an undeserved luxury when he thought of Emma and the others he had met at the shelter. "How was your experience, sir?" Thomas asked, selecting a crisp white shirt from Jackson's closet. "Illuminating," Jackson replied, toweling his hair dry. "And disturbing. We live in different worlds, Thomas, separated by nothing more substantial than the clothes on our backs and the dollars in our bank accounts." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you intend to do with these insights, if I may ask?" "Change things," Jackson said, simply accepting the shirt. Starting with Westfield Grand. An hour later, looking every inch the powerful CEO in a tailored charcoal suit, Jackson sat in his home office making calls. The first was to his assistant at Hayes Technologies. "Melissa, I need you to gather some information for me. Westfield Grand Department Store. I want to know everything about their corporate structure, their financials, their leadership, and I need it within the hour." "Of course, Mr. Hayes. Any particular reason?" "I'm considering an investment," Jackson replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. His next call was to his lawyer, Benjamin Goldstein, a sharp-minded attorney who had been with him since the early days of his company. "Ben, I need something unusual. I want to know if there's a legal pathway for me to gain significant influence over Westfield Grand, either through investment or some other means, by tomorrow." There was a pause on the line. "Tomorrow, Jackson. These things typically take weeks, if not months. I understand that, but I'm not asking what's typical. I'm asking what's possible." After a detailed discussion of options, they settled on a strategy: Westfield Grand was owned by Lux Retail Group, a publicly traded company that had been struggling financially in recent years as online shopping cut into traditional retail profits. Their stock price had been declining steadily, making them potentially vulnerable to a significant investor. If you're willing to make a large enough investment to become their biggest individual shareholder overnight, that would certainly get their attention, Ben explained. It wouldn't give you control, but it would give you leverage, especially if you hint at a potential larger acquisition down the line. Make it happen, Jackson instructed. Whatever it takes. His final call was to a private investigator he had used in the past for corporate due diligence. Daniel, I need information on a child. First name Emma, approximately 7 years old. Recently orphaned. Mother's name was Sarah Sullivan. They lived in Boston, probably not far from Beacon Hill. The mother was a waitress who fell ill about 6 months ago. I need to know their full story, any remaining family and current legal status of the child. That's not much to go on, Daniel said. Any reason for the interest? Let's just say I'm concerned about her welfare. This is time-sensitive, Daniel. I need whatever you can find by tomorrow morning. With these wheels in motion, Jackson turned his attention to preparing for his return to Westfield Grand. He wanted to make an entrance that would be impossible to ignore, a stark contrast to his invisible presence the day before. That evening, Stephanie called from Paris. Darling, you'll never believe the divine little boutique I found off the Champs-Élysées, she gushed. I've spent an absolute fortune, but it's all simply too gorgeous to resist. Jackson listened, hearing her words with new ears. Had she always sounded this superficial, or was he only noticing it now? Sounds wonderful, he replied, his mind elsewhere. Is everything all right? You sound distracted. Just busy with a new project, Jackson said. How much longer will you be in Europe? Another week, at least. Caroline wants to take the yacht to Monaco, and I simply can't say no to that. You're not upset, are you? Not at all. Take your time. After ending the call, Jackson stood at his window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Emma was finding a place to sleep, perhaps behind the library she had mentioned, or in some other hidden corner of the city. The contrast between her reality and his own was stark and shameful. Early the next morning, his phone rang with updates. Daniel had found information on Emma and her mother. Sarah Sullivan had indeed passed away from an aggressive cancer 6 months ago. There was no father listed on Emma's birth certificate, and no other family had come forward. The child welfare system had been looking for her since she had run away from her initial foster placement. Legally, she was a ward of the state. Melissa's research on Westfield Grand revealed that Marcus Reynolds, the manager who had humiliated Jackson, had a history of complaints from employees about his management style, though his results in terms of sales had kept him employed. The store was one of the flagship locations for Lux Retail Group, and Ben called with news that, through some financial maneuvering and the calling in of several favors, he had managed to purchase enough shares of Lux Retail Group to make Jackson the company's largest individual shareholder, with nearly 15% ownership. It wasn't controlling interest, but it was enough to demand attention. The CEO of Lux Retail has already called me twice this morning, Ben reported. They're in a panic about a potential hostile takeover. Good, Jackson said. Let them sweat for now. I'll be paying a visit to their Boston flagship store today. At precisely 11 a.m., Jackson's sleek black Aston Martin pulled up in front of Westfield Grand. He had deliberately chosen a car that would attract attention, not his usual style, but necessary for today's performance. As he stepped out, handed his keys to the valet with a generous tip, and straightened his bespoke suit, he noted with satisfaction the whispers of recognition from passers-by. Jackson Hayes was a recognizable figure in Boston business circles, his face having graced the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Time. As he strode through the revolving doors of Westfield Grand, heads turned, a sales associate immediately approached, her smile bright and eager. Mr. Hayes, what an honor to have you visit our store today. Is there something specific I can help you find? Jackson smiled politely. Thank you, but I'm here to see Marcus Reynolds. Is he available? Of course, sir. Let me call him right away. As she hurried off, Jackson surveyed the sales floor. It looked different from this vantage point, less intimidating, more obsequious. The same space that had seemed designed to exclude him yesterday now seemed eager to welcome him. all because of his change in appearance and perceived worth. Marcus Reynolds appeared moments later, his face flushed with excitement at the prospect of serving such a high-profile customer. "Mr. Hayes, what an unexpected pleasure," Reynolds said, extending his hand. "Marcus Reynolds, store manager. How can we assist you today?" Jackson took his hand, gripping it firmly. "Mr. Reynolds, I believe we've met before, though you may not remember the encounter." Reynolds looked confused. "I don't recall having the honor, Mr. Hayes. I'm sure I would remember meeting someone of your stature." "Indeed," Jackson said coolly. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory." He pulled out his phone and showed Reynolds a photo that Thomas had surreptitiously taken the day before. Reynolds sneering as the disguised Jackson was being escorted out. Reynolds' face went from confusion to shock to fear in rapid succession. I don't understand." "Let me clarify then," Jackson said, raising his voice enough that nearby staff and customers could hear. "Yesterday I entered this store dressed as a homeless man. Within minutes I was physically removed on your orders, after being subjected to humiliation and verbal abuse from you and your staff." Reynolds blanched. "Mr. Hayes, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't, that was the point." Jackson's voice was steel. "You didn't see a human being deserving of basic dignity. You saw an inconvenience to be removed." By now a small crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Sales associates froze in place, eyes wide with shock. We have store policies," Reynolds stammered. "Security protocols. Do these protocols include manhandling customers, using dehumanizing language, allowing your staff and clientele to mock and degrade another person?" Jackson stepped closer. "Because if so, that's interesting information for me to have, as the newest major shareholder in Lux Retail Group." Reynolds' face went ashen. "Shareholder? As of this morning, I own 15% of your parent company," Jackson stated, "which gives me significant influence over corporate policies and personnel decisions." The manager looked like he might faint. "Mr. Hayes, please, if I had known—" "That's precisely the problem, isn't it?" Jackson interrupted. "Your behavior changes based on what you think someone is worth financially. That's not just poor customer service, Mr. Reynolds. It's poor humanity." Reynolds stood speechless, perspiration beading on his forehead. "I'd like to see your office now," Jackson continued. "We have several matters to discuss, including the future of this store and your role in it." As Reynolds led the way to his office, visibly shaking, whispers erupted across the sales floor. Jackson caught snippets. "Disguised himself. Biggest shareholder now. Reynolds is finished." In the privacy of Reynolds' office, Jackson wasted no time. "I want access to the store's security footage from yesterday." "Sir, I don't have the authority to—" "Call whoever does," Jackson cut him off. "Now." While Reynolds made the call, Jackson sent a text to Thomas. "Phase 2 underway. Prepare for Emma." Within minutes, the head of security arrived with access to the previous day's footage. Jackson watched the recording of his humiliation with clinical detachment, noting which employees had participated and which had simply stood by. When it was finished, he turned to Reynolds. "I'll be making significant changes to how this store operates," he announced. "Starting today." "Mr. Hayes, please," Reynolds pleaded. "I have a family, a mortgage. I can't lose this job." Jackson studied him coldly. "Did you consider that the man you threw out yesterday might also have had a family, responsibilities, dreams?" Reynolds had no answer. "You're suspended, effective immediately," Jackson declared. "Whether that becomes permanent depends on the findings of a full review of your management practices, which I'll be initiating today." As Reynolds slumped in defeat, Jackson turned to the head of security. "I need one more thing from you. There's a little girl named Emma Sullivan who sometimes hides behind this store looking for discarded items. I need to find her immediately." The security chief looked confused but nodded. "We'll check the alleyways and back exits, sir." "Good, and when you find her, bring her to me, gently. Explain that Jackson, her friend from yesterday, is looking for her." As the security team dispersed to search for Emma, Jackson made another call, this time to the CEO of Lux Retail Group, who had been anxiously awaiting contact since the stock purchase. "Mr. Hayes, we're certainly interested in discussing your investment and vision for our company," the CEO began diplomatically. "I'm glad to hear that," Jackson replied, "because my vision begins with a complete overhaul of how your stores treat all customers, regardless of their appearance or perceived wealth. And I'm starting that transformation today at Westfield Grand in Boston. By noon, the store was buzzing with activity and rumor. Word had spread quickly about the billionaire who had disguised himself to test the store's treatment of the less fortunate, and the resulting shake-up in management. Jackson had commandeered Reynolds' office, conducting a series of meetings with department heads and establishing new protocols. And all the while, he kept one eye on the clock. He had promised to meet Emma at noon, and he intended to keep that promise, though not in the way she might expect. As the search for her continued, Jackson prepared for their reunion, knowing that the next few hours would change both their lives forever. Chapter 5. The search noon came and went with no sign of Emma. Jackson checked his watch repeatedly, worry gnawing at him. Had something happened to her? Or was she simply waiting at their meeting spot, growing increasingly convinced that he had broken his promise? The security team had searched the alleyways behind the store, the nearby park, and even the library Emma had mentioned, but found no trace of the little girl. Jackson was growing increasingly anxious. He had set so many wheels in motion: the takeover of shares, the confrontation with Reynolds, the plans for transforming the store, but none of it would feel meaningful if he couldn't help the one person who had shown him true kindness. "Sir," Thomas said, entering the office after coordinating with the security team, "there's still no sign of her. Should we expand the search perimeter?" Jackson nodded. "Yes, and contact Daniel. Have him check hospitals and police reports from last night. And get me a car. I need to check our meeting spot myself." Minutes later, Jackson was being driven to the bench where he had first met Emma. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of her small figure, but the bench was empty. He instructed his driver to wait and approached the spot where they had arranged to meet. A middle-aged woman was walking her dog nearby. Jackson approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm looking for a little girl about 7 years old, brown hair in a ponytail. She might have been waiting here earlier." The woman considered this. "I did see a child sitting on that bench about an hour ago. Looked like she was waiting for someone. Poor thing seemed nervous. Do you know which way she went?" The woman pointed toward a street leading away from Westfield Grand. "She headed that way after checking her watch a few times. Seemed disappointed." Jackson thanked her and returned to his car, directing the driver to proceed slowly in the direction the woman had indicated. He felt a pang of guilt. Emma had waited for him, just as she said she would, and he had failed to appear. From her perspective, he was just another adult who had made promises he didn't keep. As they drove, Jackson scanned the sidewalks, alleys, and storefronts, looking for any glimpse of Emma. They had covered several blocks when his phone rang. It was Daniel. "I might have something," the investigator said. "A shopkeeper on Marlborough Street called the police about an hour ago to report a child shoplifting food. The description matches your girl. What happened? Did they arrest her?" Jackson's heart raced with concern. "No, but the responding officer took her to Mercy Children's Hospital to check her out. Standard procedure for unaccompanied minors. She's there now. Child Social Services has been notified." "I'm on my way," Jackson said, ending the call and instructing his driver to head to the hospital immediately. When they arrived, Jackson strode through the emergency department entrance with purpose. At the reception desk, he identified himself and explained the situation partially. "I'm looking for a little girl named Emma Sullivan, who was brought in by police earlier today. I have reason to believe she's the daughter of a former employee of mine, and I've been searching for her since her mother's passing." The receptionist eyed him skeptically. "I can't provide information about minors to non-family members, sir. That's hospital policy." Jackson leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I understand your policy and I respect it. But this child has been living on the streets for months. I have the resources to help her, and I intend to do so through all proper legal channels. Please just tell me if she's here and if she's all right." Perhaps it was the genuine concern in his voice, or perhaps it was the Hayes name and its associated power, but the receptionist softened slightly. "She's being evaluated now. Child Protective Services is on their way." "Thank you," Jackson said. "Is there someone I can speak with about her situation? A doctor or social worker?" The receptionist directed him to a waiting area and promised to have someone come speak with him. Jackson sat, his normally composed demeanor shaken by worry. What if Emma refused to see him? What if she felt betrayed by his failure to meet her as promised? And even if he did get to see her, how could he explain his dual identity without frightening her? After what felt like an eternity, but was actually only 15 minutes, a woman in a white coat approached him. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Dr. Patel. I understand you're inquiring about Emma Sullivan." Jackson stood to greet her. "Yes, doctor. How is she?" "Physically, she's malnourished and has some minor untreated infections, but nothing immediately life-threatening," Dr. Patel explained. "Emotionally, she's very guarded. She refuses to tell us where she's been staying or who's been looking after her." "No one has been looking after her," Jackson said grimly. "She's been on her own since her mother passed away. I only learned about her situation yesterday, and I've been trying to find her since then." Dr. Patel's expression was skeptical. "And what is your relationship to Emma, Mr. Hayes?" Jackson considered how to answer. The truth was complicated and would sound implausible. "I met her yesterday under unusual circumstances. She showed me kindness when I was conducting a social experiment. When I learned she was homeless, I wanted to help her." "A social experiment?" Dr. Patel's eyebrows rose. "It's a long story," Jackson admitted. "But what matters now is that I want to make sure Emma is safe and cared for. I have the resources to ensure that happens." Dr. Patel studied him carefully. "Mr. Hayes, while your concern seems genuine, you must understand that Emma is now in the child welfare system. There are protocols and procedures that must be followed for her protection." "I understand that," Jackson assured her. "I'm not trying to circumvent any legal processes, but I would like to see her if possible, and I'd like to discuss with the appropriate authorities what role I might play in her future care." After further discussion and verification of Jackson's identity, Dr. Patel agreed to ask Emma if she was willing to see him. "I should warn you, though, she's very distrustful of adults right now, and she keeps asking about someone named Jackson, who was supposed to meet her today." Jackson winced. "That would be me, at least a version of me." "That's complicated." Dr. Patel gave him a look that suggested she thought it was more than just complicated, but she left to speak with Emma. While waiting, Jackson called Ben, his lawyer. "Ben, I need your help with something delicate. There's a child, Emma Sullivan, currently at Mercy Children's Hospital. She's in the system now, orphaned, no known relatives. I want to become her guardian." There was a pause on the line. "Jackson, that's not something that happens overnight. The courts prioritize placement with family members or in established foster homes." "Why this particular child?" "Because she needs me," Jackson replied simply. "And maybe I need her too. Just tell me what we need to do to make this happen, legally and properly." Ben sighed. "I'll make some calls, see what's possible. But don't get your hopes up for a quick resolution." After ending the call, Jackson sat back trying to organize his thoughts. His life had taken an unexpected turn in just 24 hours. What had begun as a social experiment had evolved into something far more profound, a reckoning with his own privilege and a chance to make a tangible difference in one child's life. Dr. Patel returned, her expression unreadable. "Emma has agreed to see you, but she's confused. She says she knows someone named Jackson, but he doesn't look like you." "That's because when she met me, I was disguised," Jackson explained. "As I said, it's complicated." Dr. Patel led him through the pediatric ward to a private room. Before entering, she turned to him. "She's fragile right now, Mr. Hayes. Please be gentle with her expectations." Jackson nodded and stepped into the room. Emma sat on a hospital bed, looking small and vulnerable in a hospital gown that was too big for her thin frame. Her hair had been washed and neatly combed, and there was a bandage on her arm where blood had been drawn. When she saw Jackson, her eyes widened in confusion and wariness. "Hello, Emma," he said softly, remaining near the door to give her space. She stared at him. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" "I'm Jackson," he said. "The same Jackson you met yesterday and gave water to when I was sitting outside Westfield Grand." Emma's brow furrowed. "No, you're not." Jackson had a beard and dirty clothes, and he was nice. "I was in disguise," Jackson explained, moving slowly to sit in a chair near the bed, still maintaining distance. "I was pretending to be homeless to see how people would treat me. But the person underneath, that was still me." Emma looked at him with suspicion. "Prove it," Jackson thought for a moment. "You told me your mom always said you can't tell what someone's worth by looking at their clothes. You said there's a good spot behind the library when it's not too cold. We ate hot dogs and fries, and you said the hot dog vendor had good fries. Emma's expression softened slightly, but doubt remained. If you're really Jackson, why didn't you meet me today like you promised? I tried, Jackson said earnestly, but I was at the store dealing with the people who were mean to me, to us. I was looking for you everywhere. I had people searching all around the area. I'm so sorry I missed our meeting, Emma. I broke my promise, and that was wrong of me. She studied him carefully, looking for any sign of deception. Why were you pretending to be homeless? Because I wanted to understand how people treat those they think don't matter, Jackson replied honestly. I have a lot of money, Emma, and people treat me differently because of it. They're nice to my face, but not always nice in their hearts. I wanted to see who would be kind to someone who couldn't give them anything in return. Like the people at the fancy store, Emma said, showing her quick understanding. Exactly. They were cruel to me because they thought I was worth less than them. That's stupid, Emma repeated her assessment from the day before. Yes, it is, Jackson agreed with a smile. And you were the only one who was kind to me. You shared your water even though you didn't have much yourself. A hint of a smile touched Emma's lips. You looked thirsty. I was, Jackson acknowledged, but not as thirsty as I was for kindness. And you gave me that too. They sat in silence for a moment, Emma processing this revelation, Jackson giving her time. So you're rich? She finally asked with a child's directness. Yes. Like, how rich? Rich enough for a bicycle? Jackson chuckled. Rich enough for many bicycles. Emma's eyes widened. Whoa. Then her expression grew serious again. Are you going to leave now? The doctor said people from child services are coming to take me away. No, Emma, I'm not leaving, Jackson promised. In fact, I'd like to help you if you'll let me. Help me how? Her voice was guarded, as if she'd learned not to trust offers of help. Well, that depends, Jackson said carefully. I know you've been waiting for your mom to come back, and I know how much you miss her. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. She's coming back. She's just at a different hospital getting better. Jackson moved from the chair to sit gently on the edge of the bed, still giving her space. Emma, I had someone look into what happened to your mum. I know this is hard to hear, but she was very, very sick. The kind of sick that doctors can't fix. You're lying, Emma said, but her voice wobbled with uncertainty. I wish I were, Jackson said softly. Your mom loved you very much. I'm sure of that, and she would be so proud of how brave you've been. Emma's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as months of buried grief rose to the surface. Without thinking, Jackson opened his arms and Emma launched herself into them, sobbing against his chest. He held her gently, letting her cry, his own eyes wet with tears. I don't want to go to foster care, she hiccuped between sobs. The first place was bad. They didn't care about me. I know, Jackson soothed, and that's why I want to help. I'd like to take care of you, Emma, to give you a home and food and clothes and everything you need, but most importantly to give you a family. Emma pulled back to look at him, her tear-stained face suspicious again. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. I know that you're kind, Jackson said. I know that you're smart and brave. I know that you gave water to a stranger when you had little yourself. That tells me everything important about who you are, Emma Sullivan. She wiped her nose on her sleeve. What if you stop liking me? That won't happen, Jackson assured her. And I'm not saying this would happen right away. There are rules about these things, and processes we have to follow. But I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to make sure you're safe and cared for, whether that's with me or with another family who will love you the way you deserve to be loved. As they sat together, a social worker arrived to discuss Emma's situation. Jackson excused himself to speak with her privately, explaining his interest in becoming Emma's guardian and the unusual circumstances of their meeting. The social worker was understandably cautious, but agreed to consider his application alongside other placement options. When Jackson returned to Emma's room, he found her looking out the window at the Boston skyline. What happens now? She asked without turning around. Now you'll stay here at the hospital until they're sure you're healthy, Jackson explained, joining her at the window. Then they'll find a temporary place for you to stay, while the courts decide what's best for you long term. Will I see you again? Yes, Jackson promised. I've arranged to visit you regularly, and my lawyer is working on the paperwork for me to apply to be your guardian. Emma turned to look at him. "What's a guardian?" "It's like a parent," Jackson explained. "Someone who takes care of you, makes sure you have what you need, helps you grow up strong and smart." "Like a dad?" Emma asked, her voice small. Jackson's heart swelled. "Yes, like a dad." For the first time since he'd entered the room, Emma smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I've never had a dad before." "Well," Jackson said, returning her smile, "I've never been a dad before. So maybe we can figure it out together." As the afternoon sun bathed the hospital room in golden light, Jackson sat with Emma, reading her a story from a book a nurse had brought. In less than 48 hours, both their lives had changed irrevocably. There were still many challenges ahead: legal hurdles, emotional healing, adjustments to new circumstances. But in that moment, as Emma gradually relaxed against him, Jackson knew with absolute certainty that his social experiment had led him exactly where he needed to be. Chapter 6. The Transformation. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of activity for Jackson and Emma. The legal process of becoming Emma's guardian was complex and time-consuming, but Jackson approached it with the same determination that had built his technology empire. Ben, his lawyer, assembled a team of family court specialists who worked tirelessly to navigate the system. Emma initially stayed in a foster home that Jackson had personally vetted, a warm, caring couple who understood the temporary nature of the placement, but still gave Emma the stability she desperately needed. Jackson visited daily, often bringing books, art supplies, and occasionally the ingredients for them to cook dinner together. During one such visit, as they rolled out dough for homemade pizza, Emma looked up at Jackson thoughtfully. "Are you really going to be my guardian for real?" Jackson nodded, sprinkling cheese over the sauce they had made from scratch. "That's the plan. The judge still has to approve everything, but my lawyers think it looks good." "And what about your fiancé, the one in Europe?" Emma asked, carefully placing pepperoni slices in a pattern. Jackson paused. He had mentioned Stephanie only briefly to Emma, and he was surprised she had remembered. "How did you know she was in Europe?" Emma shrugged. "You talked on the phone with her that time when you were waiting for my foster mum to finish my homework check. You sounded different when you talked to her." Children missed nothing, Jackson thought. "You're very observant. And you're right. Things with Stephanie are complicated right now." In truth, complicated was an understatement. Stephanie had returned from Europe to find Jackson in the midst of 2 major life changes: his effort to become Emma's guardian and his initiative to transform Westfield Grand into a model of corporate social responsibility. She had been less than enthusiastic about both. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she had said during their most recent argument. "If you want to help underprivileged children, write a check to charity. That's what foundations are for. Taking in some random street child is just... It's bizarre, Jackson." "Her name is Emma," Jackson had replied coldly. "And she's not random. She showed me kindness when no one else did. So reward her with a college fund or something. You don't have to turn your life upside down." "Maybe my life needed turning upside down," Jackson had responded. "Maybe I needed to see things differently." Stephanie had left that night for her own penthouse across town, and their communication since had been minimal. Jackson wasn't sure if their relationship would survive these changes, but he was surprised to find that the prospect of losing Stephanie didn't devastate him as it once might have. "Is she going to be my guardian too?" Emma asked now, bringing Jackson back to the present. "No," Jackson answered honestly. "This is just me." Emma nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. "Good, I don't think she would like me much." "Why do you say that?" "Because you said she thinks poor people aren't worth as much as rich people." Jackson winced. He hadn't said that exactly, but children had a way of cutting through to the heart of things. "I think Stephanie just doesn't understand some things the way you and I do now." While his personal life was in flux, Jackson's professional focus had sharpened. The transformation of Westfield Grand had become a passion project that consumed much of his time when he wasn't with Emma. Marcus Reynolds had been officially terminated after a thorough review of his management practices revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior toward both customers and employees deemed undesirable. Jackson had personally interviewed and hired a new manager, Denise Williams, a retail veteran with a background in community outreach. Together, they had implemented sweeping changes. The store had been renovated to include a community space where local non-profits could hold events. Their portion of the top floor, previously dedicated to luxury housewares, had been converted into a job training center for homeless and low-income individuals, teaching skills from retail customer service to basic computer literacy. Perhaps most significantly, Jackson had instituted a store policy that explicitly prohibited discrimination based on appearance or perceived wealth. All staff underwent mandatory training in dignity-affirming customer service, and mystery shoppers of all socioeconomic backgrounds regularly tested their compliance. The Lux Retail Group had initially resisted these changes, concerned about the impact on their luxury brand image. But when Westfield Grand's customer satisfaction scores began to rise and positive press coverage generated increased foot traffic, their objections had softened. Jackson had also leveraged his technology background to create a community impact tracking system that quantified the social benefit of the store's initiatives, data that he presented at the IWA, company's quarterly shareholder meeting. The other board members had been reluctantly impressed, and several had begun exploring similar programs for their own businesses. Not everyone was convinced, of course. There had been pushback from some long-time customers who complained that the store's exclusivity had been compromised. A few had even transferred their accounts to competitors. But for every customer lost, it seemed 2 new ones appeared, drawn by the store's innovative approach and ethical stance. The most meaningful validation, however, had come from the employees themselves. Many had approached Jackson to thank him for creating a workplace where they no longer had to choose between keeping their jobs and treating people with dignity. One afternoon, as Jackson was meeting with Denise in her office to review the latest community impact reports, there was a knock at the door. It was Vanessa, the sales associate who had first approached him when he was disguised as homeless. "Mr. Hayes, do you have a moment?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course," Jackson replied, gesturing for her to enter. Vanessa twisted her hands nervously. "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you that day. I've been wanting to say something since I found out it was you, but I couldn't find the courage." Jackson nodded. "I appreciate that, Vanessa, but I'm more interested in how you treat people now." "That's just it," she said, her expression earnest. "This whole experience, the training, the new policies, it's made me realize how many assumptions I was making about people based on nothing but their appearance. And not just here at work. I've started volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends, and it's opened my eyes." Jackson smiled. "That's good to hear." "The thing is," Vanessa continued, "many of the women I've met there are just like me. They had jobs, homes, families. But then something happened. Health, divorce, job loss. And suddenly they were on the other side of that invisible line. It made me realize how thin that line really is." "Exactly," Jackson said. "And that's why what we're doing here matters." After Vanessa left, Denise looked at Jackson thoughtfully. "You know, when you first proposed all these changes, I thought you were just having some sort of billionaire guilt trip. But this is real change happening in real people's lives." "It's a start," Jackson acknowledged, "but there's still so much more to do." That evening, as Jackson left Westfield Grand, he found himself reflecting on how much had changed in 3 short months. The store that had once been a temple to exclusivity and materialism was becoming something else. Still a business, still profitable, but also a force for positive change in the community. His phone rang as he walked to his car. It was the social worker assigned to Emma's case. "Mr. Hayes, I have good news. The judge has reviewed your petition for guardianship and all the supporting documentation. She's scheduled a final hearing for next Thursday." Jackson's heart leaped. "And her inclination?" "Do you have any sense of which way she's leaning?" "I don't want to get your hopes up prematurely," the social worker said, "but based on my last conversation with her, I believe she's impressed with the stability you've provided and your commitment to Emma's well-being. The fact that Emma herself has been so clear about wanting to be placed with you carries significant weight as well." "Thank you," Jackson said, emotion making his voice rough. "I'll be there Thursday. Is there anything else I should prepare?" "Just be ready to answer some final questions from the judge and perhaps think about long-term plans. Guardianship is temporary by nature. The judge may want to know if you're considering a more permanent arrangement eventually." After ending the call, Jackson stood for a moment on the sidewalk, overwhelmed by the implications. A more permanent arrangement. Adoption. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. When he arrived at the foster home to visit Emma that evening, she could tell immediately that something was different. What happened? "You look happy scared," she said as they sat at the kitchen table with her homework. Jackson smiled at her perceptiveness. "Happy scared is a good description. I just got off the phone with Ms. Hernandez. The judge has scheduled our hearing for next Thursday." Emma's eyes widened. "The hearing where she decides if I can live with you for real?" "That's the one." "And does Ms. Hernandez think the judge will say yes?" "She seems hopeful," Jackson said cautiously. "But we won't know for sure until the hearing." Emma nodded solemnly. "I've been extra good just in case the judge asks about me." Jackson laughed. "You don't need to be extra good, Emma. You just need to be you." "That's more than enough." As they worked through her math homework, Jackson found himself thinking about Stephanie again. She had called that morning, suggesting they meet for dinner to discuss their future. Jackson had agreed, but with a strange detachment. 3 months ago, his world had revolved around Stephanie's approval and affection. Now his priorities had shifted so dramatically that he barely recognized his former self. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed, Jackson sat with her foster parents in their living room. "She's really blossomed these past few months, Ellen," the foster mother commented. "When she first came to us, she barely spoke, barely ate. And now look at her. Doing well in school, making friends, talking about the future. You've given her hope, Jackson." "She's given me perspective," Jackson replied. "I thought I had everything figured out before I met her. Now I realize I was just floating through life, letting my wealth insulate me from reality. Well, whatever the reason, that little girl upstairs is thriving because of you," Ellen's husband Tom added. "And while we'll miss her something fierce when she goes to live with you, we couldn't be happier about how things have turned out." The following week passed in a blur of preparation. Jackson worked with his interior designer to finish Emma's bedroom in his penthouse, a space that balanced childlike wonder with the maturity he'd observed in her. The walls were a soft blue, her favorite color, with constellations painted on the ceiling that would glow in the dark. Bookshelves were filled with the titles she had mentioned loving, and a window seat overlooked the harbor, complete with cushions and pillows for reading. He also met with Stephanie for their promised dinner. The conversation had been civil but strained, ending with a mutual agreement that they wanted different things from life. She had returned his engagement ring, kissed his cheek, and walked out of the restaurant and his life with the elegant grace that had first attracted him to her. Jackson had felt sad, but also oddly unburdened, as if he had set down a heavy weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. The night before the hearing, Jackson couldn't sleep. He stood at his window looking out at the city lights, wondering how his life had changed so profoundly in just 3 months. From a social experiment born of restless curiosity to a complete re-evaluation of his values and priorities, all because one small girl had offered water to a stranger. His phone chimed with a text message. It was from Thomas. "Everything is prepared for tomorrow. Car will pick you up at 8:30. Emma and her foster parents will meet. You at the courthouse at 9:15. The entire legal team will be there." Jackson sent back a simple thank you and turned back to the window. Tomorrow would determine not just Emma's future, but his own. And for all his wealth and influence, this was one outcome he couldn't control. All he could do was hope that the judge would see what he had come to see, that he and Emma, against all odds, belonged together. Chapter 7. The New Beginning. The courtroom was smaller than Jackson had imagined, with warm wood paneling and natural light streaming through tall windows. Despite its modest size, it felt imposing, a place where life-altering decisions were made daily. Jackson sat at a table with Ben and the rest of his legal team, his knee bouncing nervously under the table. Across the aisle, Emma sat with her social worker and foster parents, looking tiny in a new blue dress that Ellen had helped her pick out for the occasion. When their eyes met, Jackson gave her an encouraging smile. Emma returned it, though he could see she was just as nervous as he was. They had come so far in these past months, but everything hinged on what happened in this room today. Judge Sandra Martinez entered, and everyone rose. She was a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression serious, but not unkind, as she took her seat and surveyed the room. "Good morning," she began. "We are here in the matter of guardianship for Emma Sullivan. I've reviewed all the submitted documentation extensively, but I have some additional questions before making my determination." The proceedings began with testimony from Emma's social worker, who spoke highly of Jackson's involvement and the positive changes she had observed in Emma over the past 3 months. Ellen and Tom followed, describing Emma's progress in their home and her growing bond with Jackson. Then it was Jackson's turn to take the stand. He had testified in corporate cases before, but never had so much been at stake. After being sworn in, he sat and faced the judge directly. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Martinez began, "your petition for guardianship is quite unusual. You have no prior relationship with Emma Sullivan, no family connection, and no previous experience as a parent or guardian. Why should I entrust a child's well-being to someone with no parenting experience, whose life until recently revolved around corporate acquisitions and technology development?" Jackson took a deep breath. "Your Honor, 3 months ago, I would have had no good answer to that question. I lived in a bubble of privilege, surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My money, my influence, my name on their charity boards. I thought I understood the world, but I only understood a very small, very privileged corner of it." He glanced at Emma before continuing. "When I met Emma, I was disguised as a homeless man conducting what I thought was a social experiment. I wanted to see how people would treat me if they didn't know I was wealthy. The answer was not well. I was thrown out of a store, mocked, dehumanized. But Emma, who had nothing herself, offered me water. She showed me kindness when no one else did." "That's a touching story, Mr. Hayes," the judge said. "But kindness alone doesn't qualify someone to raise a child." "No, it doesn't," Jackson agreed. "But it was the beginning of a journey that led me here. Since meeting Emma, I've reorganized my priorities, restructured my work life to allow more time for her, learned about child development and trauma-informed parenting approaches, and built a support network of childcare professionals and mentors. I've made mistakes along the way, and I'll make more. But I'm committed to learning, to growing, to being what Emma needs." The judge studied him. "And what about your lifestyle, Mr. Hayes? You run a major corporation. You travel frequently. You attend high-profile social events. How does a child fit into that world?" "My world has changed, Your Honor. I've delegated many of my day-to-day responsibilities at Hayes Technologies to allow for a more predictable schedule. I've declined all non-essential travel for the foreseeable future. And as for high-profile social events," Jackson smiled slightly, "those have never been my favorite part of the job anyway." "I see," Judge Martinez made a note. "And what about stability? Your recent breakup with your fiancée suggests personal upheaval." Jackson nodded. "Stephanie and I wanted different things. She wasn't ready for a child in her life, and I wasn't willing to compromise on my commitment to Emma. It was a difficult decision, but a clear one." The questioning continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from Jackson's childhood and family background to his plans for Emma's education and health care. Finally, the judge turned to Emma herself. "Emma Sullivan, would you please come forward?" Emma approached the bench, looking nervous but determined. The judge smiled at her, her stern demeanor softening. "Hello, Emma, I just want to ask you a few questions. You're not in any trouble, and there are no wrong answers. I just want to know how you feel. Is that okay?" Emma nodded solemnly. "How do you feel about potentially living with Mr. Hayes?" Emma glanced at Jackson before answering. "I want to live with Jackson. He listens to me. He doesn't treat me like I'm just a kid who doesn't understand things. He explains stuff to me, even hard stuff. And he makes really good pancakes." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the courtroom at the last comment. "That's important," the judge agreed with a smile. "And do you feel safe with him?" "Yes," Emma said without hesitation. "He promised he'd always make sure I was safe, and Jackson keeps his promises." "I see. And what about school? I understand you've been attending Brookside Elementary since you've been with your foster family. How would you feel about changing schools if you move in with Mr. Hayes?" "Jackson said I can stay at Brookside if I want to," Emma explained. "He said it's important for me to keep the friends I've made. He'll drive me there every day, even though it's far from his house." Judge Martinez nodded. "One last question, Emma. If you could wish for anything in the world right now, what would it be? Emma considered this carefully. I used to wish my mom would come back, but Jackson helped me understand that she can't. So now I wish for a family again, not to replace my mom because nobody could, but to not be alone anymore. The simple honesty of her answer brought tears to several eyes in the courtroom, including Jackson's. After a few more questions, Emma returned to her seat, and the judge called a brief recess to review her notes. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Jackson knelt down to Emma's level. You did great in there. Really? I was super nervous. Couldn't tell at all, Jackson assured her. You spoke from your heart, and that's always the right thing to do. When the court reconvened, Judge Martinez had made her decision. After careful consideration of all testimony and documentation presented today, I find that it is in Emma Sullivan's best interest to grant guardianship to Jackson Hayes. She looked directly at Jackson. Mr. Hayes, this responsibility is not to be taken lightly. You are being entrusted with the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of a child who has already experienced significant loss and trauma. The court will require quarterly check-ins with Emma's social worker for the first year to ensure a smooth transition. I understand, Your Honor, Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for your trust. Emma, the judge continued, turning to the little girl, congratulations on your new home. I can see how much Mr. Hayes cares for you, and how much you care for him. That's a wonderful foundation for your future together. With a final rap of her gavel, it was done. Emma was officially in Jackson's care. As the courtroom emptied, Emma ran to Jackson, who swept her up in a hug, spinning her around as they both laughed through tears of joy. We did it! Emma exclaimed. I get to come home with you. Yes, you do, Jackson confirmed. Starting today. That afternoon, after gathering Emma's belongings from her foster home and saying emotional goodbyes to Ellen and Tom, Jackson and Emma arrived at the penthouse that would now be their shared home. As the elevator doors opened directly into the spacious living area, Emma's eyes widened. This is where you live? This is where we live, Jackson corrected gently. He gave her a tour, ending with her bedroom. When he opened the door, Emma gasped. The room was everything he had hoped it would be. Beautiful, comfortable, and designed specifically with her in mind. But it was the window seat overlooking the harbor that drew her immediately. She climbed onto it, pressing her hands against the glass. You can see the whole city from here, she exclaimed. Do you like it? Emma nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. This is your home now, Emma, for as long as you want it to be. She turned to him, her expression suddenly serious. Forever? The question hung in the air between them, weighty, significant, filled with longing and hope. If that's what you want, Jackson said carefully, guardianship is a legal arrangement that can last until you're an adult, but there are other possibilities too down the road, like adoption, Emma asked, showing once again her remarkable perceptiveness. Like adoption, Jackson confirmed, but that's a conversation for another day, when we've had more time together. For now, let's focus on getting you settled in and comfortable. That evening, they cooked dinner together in Jackson's rarely used kitchen, made a mess with chocolate chip cookies for dessert, and read 3 chapters of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone before bedtime. As Jackson tucked Emma in, he felt a sense of rightness that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to admit. Jackson? Emma asked sleepily. Are you happy that the judge said yes? Happier than I've ever been, he answered truthfully. Me too, she murmured, her eyes drifting closed. Good night. Good night, Emma, sweet dreams. As the weeks passed, they settled into a routine. Mornings were a whirlwind of breakfast, getting dressed, and the drive to Brookside Elementary. Jackson had adjusted his work schedule to do drop-offs and pick-ups himself, most days, with Thomas filling in when unavoidable meetings required Jackson's presence. Evenings were for homework, dinner and family time, board games, books, occasional movies. Weekends were for adventures, museums, parks, day trips to nearby towns. They were building memories together day by day, creating the foundation of their new family. 6 months after the guardianship hearing, Jackson was honored at a business leadership gala for his transformation of Westfield Grand. The initiative had been so successful that Lux Retail Group had implemented similar programs at 5 other locations, with plans for company-wide adoption. Emma attended the gala with him, wearing a sparkly blue dress and chattering excitedly with anyone who would listen about her Jackson and how proud she was of him. As he accepted the award, Jackson looked out at the crowd of business leaders and spotted Emma in the front row beaming up at him. "Thank you for this recognition," he began. "But the credit doesn't belong to me. It belongs to a little girl who taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in compassion, who showed me that kindness costs nothing but means everything." He smiled down at Emma. "My journey began with a social experiment. I wanted to see how the world treats those it deems invisible. What I discovered was my own blindness, to privilege, to inequality, to the thin line between security and desperation that so many walk every day. Westfield Grand is just the beginning. My company is launching a new foundation focused on family homelessness prevention, with emphasis on single parents facing medical crises, because no child should lose their home because a parent gets sick. No child should have to fend for themselves on the streets of one of the wealthiest nations on earth." As applause filled the room, Jackson's gaze remained on Emma. In her eyes, he saw not the recognition of the business community or the approval of his peers, but something far more valuable, the unconditional love of family. 1 year to the day after their first meeting outside Westfield Grand, Jackson and Emma returned to that spot. The store had changed dramatically, the haughty exclusivity replaced by an atmosphere of welcome and respect. But the bench where they had first truly connected remained the same. They sat together, Emma's legs now long enough for her feet to touch the ground, Jackson's arm around her shoulders. "Do you remember that day?" he asked. "Of course," Emma replied. "You looked so sad sitting here after those mean people threw you out. I thought you needed a friend." "I did," Jackson agreed. "I just didn't know how much." Emma leaned against him comfortably. "Are we going to come here every year and remember?" "I'd like that. It's good to remember where we started." "Jackson," Emma said, her voice taking on the serious tone that always preceded an important question, "remember when you said we could talk about adoption someday? Is it someday yet?" Jackson looked down at her. This remarkable child who had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. "Is that something you want to talk about?" Emma nodded. "I want you to be my dad. Not just my guardian, my real dad." "I want that too," Jackson admitted. "I've been talking to Ben about starting the process, actually. It takes time, but if it's what we both want—" "It is," Emma said with certainty. "And then I'll be Emma Hayes instead of Emma Sullivan." "Well, you could keep Sullivan if you wanted, or be Emma Sullivan Hayes." She considered this. "Maybe my mom would like that, I think. But I want people to know we're a real family." "We already are," Jackson assured her. "A piece of paper doesn't make a family. Love does." Emma rolled her eyes in the way only a precocious 8-year-old could. "I know that, but I still want the paper." Jackson laughed. "Then we'll get the paper and have a celebration with all our friends. And maybe even take that trip to Disney World you've been hinting about for months." "Really?" Emma's eyes lit up. "Can we stay in the Castle Hotel?" "We can stay wherever you want." As they walked back to where Thomas waited with the car hand in hand, Jackson reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as curiosity about how the other half lived had evolved into a profound lesson in what truly mattered in life. His wealth had once been his primary identity. Now it was simply a tool, useful for providing security and opportunities, but meaningless without love, compassion, and purpose to guide its use. Emma had given him those gifts, awakening him to a richer existence than all his billions could ever purchase. And in return, he had given her what every child deserves: safety, stability, and the unwavering love of a parent, not a perfect parent, certainly. He made mistakes daily, learned as he went, sometimes felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. But he showed up every day with his whole heart. As they drove home, truly home, Jackson glanced in the rearview mirror at Emma, who was chattering excitedly about her upcoming school play. She caught his eye and smiled, a smile so full of trust and love that it still took his breath away. One act of kindness had changed everything: a cup of water, offered by a child with nothing to a man who had everything he thought he needed. The smallest gestures often carried the greatest power: to heal, to connect, to transform. Jackson Hayes, once defined by his wealth, was now defined by something far more valuable: the love of a little girl who had seen his humanity when he was at his most invisible. And Emma Sullivan, once alone in the world, had found not just security, but belonging in the heart of a man who had learned what truly mattered. Together, they had discovered the greatest luxury of all, a family built on compassion, forged in kindness, and bound by love that asked for nothing in return.